Hello. The aim of this short video is to talk about the rules on statutory interpretation. At the end of this short video, I'm hoping that you would understand the three different types of statutory interpretation and how they apply to scenario questions in your assessment. Now, the first question we need to ask ourselves is, why is there a need for statutory interpretation? And even before that question, what is statutory interpretation? Statutory interpretation is the way in which the courts interpret an Act of Parliament created by the UK Parliament. So a typical example will be if a defendant stands before a court and the court has to deal with whether they have committed the offence of theft, the court would have an Act of Parliament to interpret, and then they apply the laws to the individual stood in front of them. So, for example, if you commit theft, then an Act of Parliament called the Theft Act 1968 would suggest that you would have appropriated property belonging to another with the intention of permanently depriving the owner of such property. How do we know what appropriation means, or what is appropriation? What is classed as property? When do we know that property belongs to another person? Did the individual have intention, or were they dishonest in taking property belonging to another? These are all questions that the court would have to ask themselves. And in order to do that, they must understand and be able to interpret correctly the law in front of them. So how many types of statutory rules do we have? There are three main types of rules on statutory interpretation. They are the literal rule, the golden rule, and the mischief rule. If we start with the first one, what is the literal rule? The literal rule is simply where the courts give words of an Act of Parliament or statute or legislation their plain and ordinary meaning. So this means that if the court suggests that an individual, a man, could be guilty of an offence, if they are found loitering in a town centre, then unless you're a man, then you wouldn't have committed any offence by loitering in the city centre. The courts used the literal rule in a case called Whiteley and Chapman. A particular Act of Parliament in this case made it an offence to impersonate another person entitled to vote. The defendant in this case impersonated or took the details of a deceased individual. He managed to use those details to vote. The difference here was that the persons whose details were stolen had to be entitled to vote. But as already mentioned, the individual was deceased. So had the defendant impersonated a person entitled to vote? The answer is no, they hadn't. Did they get away with the offence? Yes, they did. Does that make sense? No, it doesn't. However, if you use the literal rule, then you must follow exactly the words created in that Act of Parliament. Another example of a case where the literal rule was applied is the case of London and North Eastern Railway and Berryman, where you could claim compensation if you were accidentally killed whilst you were repairing or relaying the train tracks. The defendant in this particular case was maintaining the train tracks and not repairing or relaying. This meant that his widow, who tried to claim compensation, was not entitled to any compensation because her husband was only maintaining but not relaying or repairing. As you would agree with me, this case, or the outcome of the case, does not make much sense. So that's a clear example of the first rule on statutory interpretation, the literal rule. The second example is the golden rule. The golden rule is simply a modification on the literal rule. So in other words, in certain cases, if you interpret an Act of Parliament that gives an absurd or on justified result, then you would use the golden rule to reach a more suitable and acceptable conclusion. A case where the golden rule was used is the case of Adler and George, where the defendant argued that they hadn't broken any laws because they were not within the vicinity of a prohibited place, but they were actually in the vicinity of that prohibited place. The courts this time, instead of using the literal rule, used the golden rule to agree that the defendant had actually committed an offence. This gave a better outcome and ensured that Parliament's intentions were fulfilled. Another case that deals with the golden rule is the case of Rees-Sigsworth, where the defendant murdered his mother, and under an Act of Parliament he was entitled to inherit his mother's property. The courts refused to use the literal rule to interpret that Act of Parliament and agreed that the golden rule would be a better option to interpret the law against an individual benefiting from their crime. So in Rees-Sigsworth, following the golden rule, the defendant who had killed his mother, even though he was entitled to inherit his mother's property, was not allowed to do so. The third and final rule of interpretation is the Mischief Rule. The Mischief Rule is simply where the courts look at the intention of Parliament and seek to find out the mischief that Parliament intended to remove from society, and therefore follow that particular intention. The case of Smith and Hughes is a good example of where the Mischief Rule was used. In this case, there was a law against individuals soliciting for business in the streets. The defendants involved in this case were soliciting from balconies or from private areas. Nevertheless, they were still causing a nuisance to persons who were carrying out their daily duties. The courts agreed that the mischief that Parliament intended to prevent was the harassment by the prostitutes of persons going about their daily duties. And therefore, even though they were not in the street as required by the Act of Parliament, they were still causing a mischief and therefore had broken the law. So, as a quick summary, there are three main rules on statutory interpretation: the literal rule, the golden rule, and the Mischief Rule. And all these rules are there to help the courts to effectively interpret the will and intention of Parliament when they create laws. I hope you find this short video useful, and I hope it helps you to complete any questions or formative and summative assessments you have on the rules of statutory interpretation. Thank you for watching.